Our final speaker of session 1 is Pranav Garamidi. Pranav is a research partner at A16Z Crypto.
All right, thanks for having me. So today I'm going to be talking about the economics of transaction lending under MCP. And so this is going to be slightly different from my talk on Monday in that this is going to be kind of a higher level kind of practical overview of how I imagine the economics are working out. And so there is no paper attached to this per se, but very much influenced by kind of joint work with all the authors listed, Adityan, Bruno, Max, and Joachim, across many different papers in MCP that we've been working on. Yes, and then as always, disclosure is not investment advice, personal opinion, yada, yada. Okay, so kind of for Monday, we saw that now we have all these MCP protocols, and they promise very strong inclusion guarantees, but I think there's still kind of a key question that these are all kind of still consensus modeled, and the economics of this still hasn't been fully worked out. And so there's a key question of how do these guarantees play out in practice, and in particular, kind of how much do users actually have to pay in practice to get these guarantees. And so there's really kind of two key concerns that I think come up in practice. One is that in the consensus model, we can kind of assume, hey, like we have this honesty assumption, it's going to be one honest guy. They are definitely going to include my transaction, and we're kind of just going to assume that they have enough space to include me, right? And so this is what lets us state very clean properties in the consensus setting, but is of course in practice not going to be true. In practice, we're going to have all the proposers being rational, and in particular, kind of all the proposers with finite capacity, right? So they have to make trade-offs on deciding exactly what they include. And so what that means is proposers will kind of only include transactions that are paying them enough and outweighing the opportunity cost of not including them. And so that's kind of the key thing we want to analyze. And so I think the first thing to really ask is who are these proposers? And so I'm not going to be referring to any protocol in specific here, but kind of towards the broader class. And I'll say this is more inspired by Solana than anybody else, but it applies kind of broadly generally. And really the property we would love to have, I think, is to have effectively like infinite proposers and just say super generally, if you have X% of stake, you get X% of the block space and your proposer kind of forever. Now in practice, that's not like really feasible from an engineering perspective of bandwidth and various other reasons. And so really, I think most protocols have been proposing anywhere from 4 to 16-ish proposers in practice right now. And so a way that we can kind of approximate this ideal state of having kind of everybody who has stake be allowed to be a proposer is have this set rotate very slowly, right? And so the reason we rotate quickly traditionally in consensus protocols is because if a leader is Byzantine, then we have a pretty bad time in a single leader context. And so what we want to do is rotate through the Byzantine leader and get to an honest leader very quickly. But now that we've kind of decoupled the leader role from the proposer role, and there's not as much bad stuff an individual Byzantine proposer can do, it's actually totally fine to rotate this out very slowly. And so here on this slide, I'm saying rotate once per slot. You can imagine rotating once per 4 slots or 16 slots or what have you. Point being that there's actually lots of benefits on the economic side to having this proposer set be extremely stable. Okay, so now in practice then, like who like actually are these people? We've sampled them by stake. And so I think there's roughly 4 buckets here. So one is going to be smaller validators, right, kind of like at-home traditional validators that we have today. One is going to be institutional validators, think like your Coinbases of the world. They're kind of people who, as a business, have lots of stake and run large validation operations. There's also going to be RPC providers, right? So traditionally, on Solana, the RPC providers themselves have lots of stake, and so that's so that they can offer kind of better service and have a better view of the chain state. And kind of the final category is applications. And so I think the small validator and kind of institutional validator side is pretty clear. So we already have today and kind of already access proposers. And maybe just one thing to note there in terms of the differences is that if you're a small validator, given that we have like a small constant number of proposers, you're probably not often going to be a proposer. And so the guarantees you can offer to users' applications is kind of, hey, when I'm online, like please send to me. But some of like the reputation dynamics don't work quite as well. Whereas if you're an institutional validator and you have enough proposers and enough stake, then it actually is like plausible that maybe you're just constantly a proposer, or say like for 70, 80% of the time, you like have a block that's acting as a proposer. And so you really could say, hey, like if you want to land transactions with me, like I will have capacity every single slot, like let's make some deal. I think one of the most interesting parts of this is the RPC side, where today RPCs are in the business of offering kind of good quality of service to various applications. And today, the best they can do is say, hey, like, send me your transaction. I will forward it to the mass stability, to whoever's leader right now, and try to get included as fast as possible. But in an MCP world, they could just literally be a proposer themselves for many of these slots and just directly include user transactions. And so I think like the role of RPCs probably gets even bigger in this world. And then kind of echoing the previous talk, I think applications are also interesting here, where you can imagine for specifically like perp sexes or any kind of like application that really needs extremely strong inclusion guarantees to like say land liquidations or whatever have you. Today the best they can do is just forward to an RPC and like hope they get included or have kind of special relationships with the infra layer. But I think it's interesting, like in an MCP world, maybe they actually just get delegated stake themselves to have some guaranteed block capacity at every slot. So that's roughly who I'm thinking of as kind of being the main actors here in practice. And okay, so now let's get to the fees themselves. And so roughly, I think an MCP protocol should have 3 categories of fee. So the first is just a base fee. And so this is the traditional base fee we have today. And it's like some small static thing, just covering the cost of signature verification and maybe like some bandwidth costs, right? And so that's like a small just static fee every transaction has to burn to be eligible to be included. The second is the ordering fee. And so this is what's going to be used kind of after you confirm all of your like blocks of transactions. You have to union them and take an ordering of them. So I think it's mentioned multiple times in all these talks now, you need some deterministic ordering rule. The most reasonable seems to just be doing priority fee ordering. It gives you lots of benefits that I'm not going to go into in this talk on kind of application-specific sequencing. But that seems kind of like the best ordering rule that we have and gives also nice economic properties. It is important to note this fee has to be burned. If you didn't burn this, then anybody who's a proposer could basically get extremely high priority transactions for free, which would break a lot of those economic properties. And so like actually like normally that ordering fee in like single leader protocols is what goes to the validator. So that is actually like a decent change in the economics there. And then the last category fee here is the inclusion fee, which goes directly to the proposer. And so the inclusion fee is basically what incentivizes the proposer to actually include you. And we'll go into this one in particular the most of. I think both the base fee and the ordering fee are kind of like not so relevant to the incentives at the transaction landing layer. They're kind of more specific at the base fee is kind of just, it should be small and relatively irrelevant. And the ordering fee is only relevant at the app layer, but the inclusion fee is what's most relevant for incentivizing people to actually include your transactions. Cool, and so I think that one after question is, okay, so we have these inclusion fees, and so how much will people actually have to pay in the inclusion fee to get included by a proposer? And really, I think it's just going to be that every proposer is free to run their own mechanism, and what I mean by mechanism here is kind of very general. And so you can imagine that some proposers might want to do something like say, hey, like I have a reserve price for entry, I'm just running like a first price auction, I have this much capacity, whoever has the highest bids, like we're gonna get in. Maybe it's a second price auction, kind of it's up to them. I think what's probably going to be common is that certain applications are just going to make deals with large pools of stake, whether they be RPCs, institutional validators, or whatever have you. And they're just going to say, hey, I want like this much capacity every single slot for the next 6 months or something. And like, here's the rate I'm willing to pay. Like, just please include me whenever you get my transactions. I think that makes a lot of sense for a lot of applications, kind of both on the supply side of proposers and also on the application side. I think for the most part, this will run out of protocol. And so this inclusion fee I mentioned is, it's going to be a thing that's expressible inside the transaction. But it could also just be an off-chain payment, and I think that's totally fine. To the extent that that inclusion fee is like part of the transaction semantics, is just kind of to make it easier for smaller validators to like run these mechanisms without relying on off-chain infra. But it's not really a big deal if this is in or out of protocol. And then I think the important part from an economics perspective for kind of efficient transactions is that these proposers by themselves have pretty little pricing power, right? So this is kind of the whole point of MCP to a large extent, that instead of there being one kind of monopolist entity who kind of decides transaction inclusion for everybody, at any point in time, there are multiple people kind of who can offer the service of including you into the block. And so what that means is that at a very base level, kind of, those entry fees should be fairly commoditized. But you could imagine things like certain proposers run TEs for like better privacy guarantees and to like actually guarantee that they're running some mechanism or what have you. Maybe some proposers have lower latency connections they offer to users or something like this. So you could imagine there's kind of like, again, like out of protocol add-ons that certain proposers want to offer. Maybe they charge more for it. But for the pure commodity layer of just like landing your transaction, you expect that to be pretty cheap. Okay, so I think it's a natural question of, so now, before we had one proposer, and so, thinking about how to maximize the welfare in some sense of choosing the most valuable transactions seemed pretty simple. Everybody sends to this one person, they run some mechanism, they include the most valuable things. It's pretty straightforward. Like a very natural question in MCP is, hey, like, we went from 1 entry point to like 5 entry points or 10 entry points, and they all have kind of, like now 1/5 or 1/10 of the capacity as a single entry point. How do we actually imagine the transactions being routed across all these people? And so this is where the proposer set being very stable, I think, is very important, where it's nice that we have these repeated game dynamics, basically, where, it's like a stable set of proposers. Like, while net transaction flows definitely change kind of day to day, they probably don't change so much second to second. Or, even if there's like a jump at 1 second, like over the preceding minute or something, hopefully it stabilizes. And so you kind of naturally expect that transactions kind of will route themselves across these proposers. And that comes from the form of literally, like I was mentioning before, of like applications just making deals explicitly with certain proposers to have guaranteed capacity. In that case, then you kind of ahead of time kind of clear this market. Or, over time, some proposers kind of show, like emit some events showing they're like under congestion and transactions naturally route to other places. And so I think this kind of is a concern in like the single shot model where you're like, how possibly could like transactions know where to send to like this new set of proposers? But kind of in this world where applications and users are directly sending to like specific proposers, I think it's not so big of a problem. That kind of just over time, it should like naturally equilibrate. And I think one important technical detail here is you want your protocol to satisfy the property that users can specify exactly which proposers they're sending to as part of their transaction. And what this means is that when a proposer includes that transaction, they have like a guaranteed inclusion fee they can collect. Right, so like one natural like DOS thing that's annoying is the user says, oh, like I'm going to pay this inclusion fee, and then they send it to all of the, all the proposers. And then if a proposer isn't sure if they will actually get paid the inclusion fee that the transaction says it will pay them, that's a massive headache and like leads to like more out of protocol stuff that's kind of annoying. So that's just like a quality of life thing that should definitely kind of be in these protocols to make these dynamics work out in a nice way. Okay, I think it is making this distinction of what transaction capacity means. So there's actually 2 different ways to do this in MCP. And so one is to make a very strict guarantee that if a proposer includes you, you will definitely be executed. And so this is the traditional thing kind of you've been talking about with a lot of these definitions of censorship resistance. Now, the tricky thing here is you have to pre-allocate kind of an exact compute budget to each of the proposers. And what that means is like if your demand like happens to be a bit miscalibrated in terms of like routing across proposers, that you lose some effective throughput. And if you move to like more multi-dimensional kind of gas accounting things, either like parallel execution or even just like storage and compute and type of thing, how you break up those kind of different dimensions across the proposer set is pretty tricky, right? Like if one app is sending all of its transactions to one proposer and a different app is sending all its transactions to a different proposer, like those are distinct pieces of state, and so they all like would execute in time. But if you kind of cut your compute limits per state to be proportional as well, then you'd have issues where apps are kind of forced to send to multiple proposers. And so, while this has like the nicest inclusion guarantees, it leads to a lot of annoying things at the execution layer. The other thing you can do that's like kind of the opposite end of the spectrum is say, hey, like if you're included, instead of giving each proposer a compute budget, just give them a bandwidth budget and say, hey, like we will certainly consider every transaction included by every proposer, but in the deterministic ordering of all the transactions, you might cut off the tail, right? Like we will execute the prefix as far as we can, which are going to be the highest priority transactions, And if you run out of compute execution time, we're just going to stop at some point and kind of either forward the tail to another block or do something else with it. So this has weaker inclusion guarantees, or even if somebody includes you, if your priority fee is too low, you might not get executed, but it does give you a higher kind of effective throughput under annoying workloads. So I think either are reasonable choices, but it's kind of we'll see what works the best in practice. Okay, so how much do users actually pay? And so I think there's actually two important regimes here. So there are extremely high value transactions, like maybe again like liquidations or like trades or cancel orders that like extremely like need to be included, and it's really bad if they don't be included. And so you kind of expect these people to like be very intentional in sending to at least say 2 trusted proposers. Maybe not just one, maybe they pick 2 or 3 or 4. It's kind of up to them. And accordingly, if they send to M people, they pay M times this inclusion fee. Which makes sense. They're kind of taking up M times the bandwidth of as if they only sent to 1 person. On the other hand, if you're just a very low value transaction, maybe you're a payment, you don't mind being delayed a second if you didn't happen to get in, or maybe just whatever kind of low value time insensitive transaction, or not even low value, but just time insensitive, where not being included is not the biggest deal for you. In this case, you're probably fine sending to a single person. And here the fee should be quite low. It should be the same as it is today, if not even lower. And so kind of the regime we imagine is if censorship is important to you, you pay a bit more for it. If it's not that important to you, you should never pay too much, and like you probably almost certainly still get included very quickly. But there's some increased chance that they get delayed by a block or 2 if something breaks the proposal you sent it to. Okay, and so given all of this, where does censorship resistance come in from in practice? And so, on Monday, I gave this talk kind of with this big general model, this big equilibrium model, but even that was in the single shot setting. I think very practically, this comes more naturally from like a repeated game setting, where, in practice, like users are not the ones deciding like what leader they send to, right? It's really like either the front end or application on their behalf is like picking like who to send this thing to. And so really there's going to just be kind of relatively like known relationships between these applications and wallets and different proposer sets or like different staking pools. And so really you're going to have that like every proposer is basically going to be competing for business with each other of saying, hey, like I offer this quality of service, like I'm going to include you, like please pay me this money up front, or like, just trust, like we will have like a trusted business relationship. And so if one of those proposers screws the application over by not including their transaction or just being bad at their jobs, like infra-wise, then the alternative set of proposers will just kind of take their business, right? And so by censoring a certain application, you lose all of their order flow for the indefinite future, if you breach an agreement with them. And so I think this is kind of the sticky relationship dynamic that is now possible with having competition at every single slot. That we kind of expect to really drive the censorship guarantees in practice. Okay, so just wrapping up here in almost out of time. The important part of MCP is there is multiple entry points, so they can all compete with each other. What that means is they both compete on quality of service and on cost, which is not something they're forced to do today. And what that gives you is a censorship resistance at these competitive prices with kind of the additional feature that if you are an application, it's up to you to decide how many people to send to and how much you want to pay for that accordingly. So yeah, that's all I got. Thanks.
Looks like there's MEV at the microphone. Congratulations on 4 in a row, Pranav, I think, at this event. So I think maybe one theme that's come up in your presentation is a lot of sort of integration across the different layers of the stack. And if you think of like how the Ethereum ecosystem has evolved, a lot of the focus has been trying to prevent this kind of integration, trying to keep validators kind of simple. And I think you described 2 kinds of things that have been sort of anti-goals in the Ethereum ecosystem. One being like having validators participate in relatively complex competition and having there be returns to size in that competition. And the latter is sort of applications having these like direct business relationships with the infrastructure. I'm curious whether you see these as problematic and whether you think there's anything that can be done.
Yeah, so I will say one thing is I think it is worth distinguishing like validator and proposer, and so you don't have to make this distinction, but I think at least one thing that's nice, at least about like like the constellation and I think like some of the AMP design is like you can have your validator set that is doing core consensus duties in terms of like being a consensus leader in terms of like voting on things and testing on things. And that part of the stack, none of this applies to. They are just doing boring running software jobs. And so actually, I think one nice thing about this design, or like this kind of just this category of design,